A former Marine was buying groceries when his German Shepherd suddenly froze. Ahead of them, an elderly Vietnam veteran stood counting coins, only to come up $4.12 short for bread and a few basic groceries. Someone in line muttered, "Put something back." But the dog didn't move. He growled softly, stepped forward, and pressed against the old man's trembling hand. Then the Marine noticed who was waiting outside beside a gray pickup truck, and that simple moment became the beginning of a secret no one in the store would ever forget. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of courage, loyalty, and hope. Snow swept across Grand Rapids, Michigan, burying sidewalks beneath white drifts and turning the morning sky the color of cold steel. Michael Turner entered the neighborhood supermarket with Atlas walking close beside his left leg. At 39, Michael still carried the disciplined posture of the Marine Staff Sergeant he had once been. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders and narrow at the waist, with powerful arms built more by stubborn routine than vanity. His dark brown hair was clipped short, though faint gray had begun to gather above his ears. A straight nose, hard cheekbones, and a square jaw covered in 2 days of rough stubble gave him the severe appearance of a man who did not invite conversation. Yet his gray-blue eyes revealed something quieter beneath the hard edges, an exhaustion that had never entirely left him after his final deployment. Michael treated strangers politely, but kept them at a careful distance. Years earlier, an explosion overseas had taken 2 Marines from his unit and left him with the belief that closeness was merely grief waiting for its turn. Atlas was the only living soul permitted beyond that wall. Atlas was a 5-year-old German Shepherd with a deep black saddle across his back, warm tan fur along his chest and legs, and intelligent amber eyes that seemed to notice emotions before people admitted having them. He was large without being clumsy, his body lean, muscular, and controlled. One ear carried a small notch from an old training accident, while his thick tail moved only when he truly meant it. Atlas had been trained to detect distress, follow scent trails, and remain calm amid noise. But Michael believed the dog possessed an instinct no trainer could have taught. Atlas understood silence. He knew when Michael's quiet meant peace, and when it meant memories were closing in. Michael wanted coffee, eggs, and dog food, nothing more. He moved through the store with a plastic basket in one hand, passing bright shelves and tired shoppers, while an old Christmas song played too softly through the ceiling speakers. At the checkout, he chose the shortest line and stopped behind an elderly man wearing a faded navy coat and a Vietnam veteran cap. Frank Dalton was 79, though hunger, worry, and long Michigan winters had added years that did not belong to him. He was tall, in the way old trees were tall once strong, now slightly bent by weather. His shoulders had narrowed beneath his coat, and his pale skin looked thin against the deep lines around his mouth. Wisps of white hair escaped beneath his cap. A carefully trimmed white mustache rested above lips that seemed permanently prepared to apologize. Frank's blue eyes were gentle but restless, moving from the register screen to the coins in his palm, and then, for the briefest moment, toward the glass doors. He had once been known among friends as a patient man who could repair an engine without swearing and calm an angry neighbor with a cup of coffee. Age had not destroyed that kindness, but fear had taught it to hide. On the conveyor belt lay a loaf of wheat bread, 6 eggs, a small bottle of milk, and 2 cans of chicken soup. Emily Parker, the cashier, scanned them one at a time. Emily was 24, petite and fair-skinned, with straight blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail and faint shadows beneath her green eyes. She had a soft face made sharper by fatigue. Working morning shifts at the supermarket and evening shifts at a diner had made her efficient, hurried, and sometimes less patient than she wished to be. Still, there was no cruelty in her, only exhaustion. $14.87, she said. Frank emptied his pockets. Quarters clicked against the counter, followed by dimes and nickels. His fingers trembled as he counted. Once, then again. Emily checked the amount. "You're short $4.12, sir." A man behind Michael sighed loudly. Todd Miller was in his late 40s, heavy through the middle, with ruddy cheeks, thinning sandy hair, and a thick brown mustache. He wore a contractor's jacket dusted with snow and carried the impatient air of someone who believed every delay was a personal insult. Then put something back, he muttered. Some of us have places to be. Frank's shoulders folded inward. Shame entered his face without drama, as though it knew the way. He looked at the milk, then the eggs, then rested his hand on the loaf of bread. Bread could stretch across several days. That was why choosing it hurt. I'll leave this, he whispered. Atlas suddenly stopped breathing in the ordinary way. Michael felt the change before he saw it. The dog's body went rigid, but not with aggression. Atlas took half a step backward, ears lifting, amber eyes fixed on Frank's shaking hand. A low sound stirred in his chest and vanished. Then Atlas moved forward. Todd leaned away. Emily froze with one hand above the register. Atlas approached Frank slowly, lowered his head, and placed it gently beneath the old man's open palm. Frank stared down at him. His fingers remained suspended for a moment, afraid even kindness might be taken away. Then they settled into the shepherd's warm fur. Something in Frank's face broke not loudly, but enough for Michael to see the loneliness beneath the fear. Michael placed his basket beside Frank's groceries. Ring everything together. Frank turned. No, son, I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything, Michael said quietly. We're both buying groceries. Emily scanned the bread again. Michael paid before Frank could protest. Yet as she packed the food, Michael noticed the old man glance toward the doors once more. Beyond the frost-covered glass stood a narrow man in a black coat beside a gray pickup truck. His face was hidden beneath a dark knit cap, but his attention was unmistakable. He was not waiting for someone. He was watching Frank. Frank took his bag, thanked Michael in a voice that barely held together, and walked outside. The man beside the truck immediately straightened, stepped away from the vehicle, and followed him into the falling snow. Michael watched Frank disappear through the sliding doors, while the man beside the gray pickup stepped away from the truck and followed him into the snow. Atlas had already turned toward the exit, his body still and attentive, waiting for the command Michael had not yet spoken. Michael lifted his grocery bag, moved through the doors, and let the cold strike his face. The parking lot had become a wide sheet of gray ice beneath the falling snow, forcing shoppers to move carefully between rows of vehicles. Frank walked faster than his age should have allowed, clutching the plastic bag against his chest while keeping his head down. The stranger remained 20 feet behind him, never hurrying, never calling his name, adjusting his pace whenever Frank slowed. Michael recognized the pattern immediately. It was not the awkward pursuit of someone trying to catch up. It was control, practiced through repetition. Atlas walked at Michael's left side, his long body lowered slightly, black and tan coat rippling over tense muscles. The softness he had shown Frank inside the store was gone. His amber eyes now tracked the stranger's movements, while his ears shifted between the footsteps ahead and Michael's breathing. Michael kept enough distance to avoid being noticed. He had learned long ago that stepping in too early could scatter danger without removing it. First, he needed to understand why Frank was afraid. Wait, Emily Parker's voice came from behind them. Michael turned and saw the young cashier hurrying across the sidewalk without a coat, wearing only her red store vest over a thin gray sweater. Snow caught in her blonde ponytail, and her cheeks had already turned pink from the cold. She stopped near Michael, breathing hard, one hand gripping a folded receipt. The fatigue that had made her impatient inside had been replaced by worry. That man, she said, glancing toward the gray pickup. I've seen him before. Michael's eyes stayed on Frank. How often? Emily swallowed. 3 times this week, maybe 4. He never buys anything. He stands near the doors and watches older customers. She lowered her voice, ashamed that she had noticed without acting sooner. Mostly people paying with cash, people counting coins. Veterans, too. Michael finally looked at her. She seemed younger outside the bright store lights, more frightened and more honest. Did you see his plate? Emily held out the receipt. On the back, she had written several numbers and letters in blue ink. Only part of it, Michigan plate, 7, K, something, 9. I wrote it down when I saw him follow Mr. Dalton last Tuesday. Michael folded the receipt and placed it in his coat pocket. Go inside. Call the police if we don't return. Emily nodded, but Hesitation held her in place. Is Frank in trouble? Michael looked toward the old man crossing the far end of the lot. He already was. Frank passed the last line of parked cars and turned toward the loading area behind the supermarket. The building blocked most of the wind there, but the narrow passage was darker, bordered by concrete walls, stacked wooden pallets, and two rusted dumpsters half buried in snow. Delivery trucks had polished the ice into uneven black patches. Michael slowed before reaching the corner and signaled Atlas to stay close. Frank entered the alley without looking around, which troubled Michael more than hesitation would have. The old veteran knew where he was going. The stranger followed. Michael stopped just beyond the corner, hidden by the brick wall, while Atlas stood beside him without making a sound. Through the wind, they heard the crinkle of the grocery bag and Frank's shallow breathing. Then the stranger spoke. "You're late." Frank's voice came weakly. "I had trouble inside." Michael leaned just far enough to see them. The stranger stood several feet from Frank, taller than he had appeared through the frosted glass. He was perhaps 42, lean and long-limbed, with narrow shoulders beneath a black parka. A dark knit cap covered most of his hair. An uneven brown stubble sharpened a thin face with hollow cheeks and a crooked nose that looked as though it had been broken years before. His eyes were small, dark, and strangely calm. He did not possess the wild anger of a desperate man. His patience was colder than anger. He carried himself like someone who had frightened people so often that fear had become routine. "I don't care what happened inside," he said. "You know what day it is." Frank tightened both hands around the grocery bag. "My check doesn't come until Friday. I can give you something then." The stranger stepped closer. "You said that last week. The heating bill was higher. I needed food." Frank's gaze dropped to the snow between them. The shame from the checkout line had changed into something deeper now, an old submission learned through repeated threats. "Please, just give me a few more days." The stranger reached for the bag. Frank resisted for one brief second, not with strength but instinct, and the man tore it from his hands. The thin plastic split against the corner of a wooden pallet. A carton of eggs struck the pavement with a wet crack. The milk rolled beneath a dumpster, and the loaf of wheat bread landed in dirty snow. Frank stared at it, as though the sight hurt more than the loss itself. That bread had cost him humiliation inside the store, and now it lay crushed beneath a stranger's boot. "You think I care what you eat?" the man asked. Frank bent toward the groceries, but the stranger seized the front of his navy coat and pulled him upright. Frank's cap shifted sideways, exposing the thin white hair beneath it. His breathing became fast and uneven. "I serve this country," he whispered, though the words sounded less like pride than a final appeal to a world that had forgotten him. The man's expression did not change. He tightened his fist in Frank's collar and forced him back against the metal dumpster. "And now you owe us." Frank lifted both hands but did not strike him. Michael felt Atlas move half a step forward beside him. The dog's muscles hardened, yet he remained silent, waiting. The stranger leaned closer to Frank and spoke in a voice barely louder than the wind. "Next time, we won't just take your money. Take your hands off him." Michael's voice cut through the alley without rising. The stranger turned, still gripping Frank's collar, and the calm in his face cracked. Michael stepped into view, shoulders squared beneath his winter coat, gray-blue eyes fixed on him. Atlas moved half a pace ahead, his black and tan body lowered, ears forward, amber eyes unwavering. He did not bark or bare his teeth. The silence of a trained dog prepared to act was more convincing than noise. The stranger released Frank and stepped back. Up close, Michael saw a crooked nose, rough brown stubble, hollow cheeks, and a narrow scar beneath his right ear. "This doesn't concern you," he said. His name was Eric Donovan, 42, lean and long-limbed, with the cold patience of a man who had learned that quiet threats controlled people better than fists. Years working repossessions had taught him how to choose frightened targets. "It concerns me now," Michael replied. Eric glanced at Atlas, then toward the street. "Tell the old man his debt just doubled." He backed away and vanished into the snow. Frank remained against the dumpster, breathing in short clouds. Michael did not touch him immediately. Men who had lived under fear for too long sometimes mistook help for another demand. Atlas approached first and pressed his shoulder against Frank's leg. The old man's hand sank into the dog's warm fur. "He'll come back," Frank whispered. "They always do." Michael gathered the milk and dented soup cans while Frank stared at the broken eggs and the loaf darkening in dirty slush. The loss was small, but humiliation had made it enormous. "Where do you live?" Michael asked. Frank shook his head. "You've done enough." "That wasn't my question." Frank finally pointed toward an older neighborhood beyond the rail yard. Michael carried the surviving groceries, and the three of them walked through the storm. Frank's house was a faded blue structure with a sagging porch and windows patched with clear plastic. Inside, the air was scarcely warmer than outdoors. A portable heater hummed beside a worn armchair, while unpaid bills sat in careful piles across the kitchen table. Prescription bottles stood beside an empty coffee tin, and pension dates were circled on a wall calendar. Frank had arranged everything neatly, as though order were the last thing poverty had not taken. "Donovan says I borrowed from the wrong people," he said, removing his cap and smoothing his thin white hair. $200 for a furnace repair. I paid it back. They said I didn't." Then the interest started. Shame tightened his mouth. Michael felt anger rise, but kept it behind the discipline war had carved into him. He knew men like Eric men who hunted those already trained to suffer quietly. While Frank placed the remaining groceries on the counter, Michael noticed a framed photograph hanging crooked above the mantel. Two young soldiers stood beside a damaged military truck beneath a hard white sky. One was clearly Frank, broad-chested and dark-haired, his gentle blue eyes untouched by age. The other had Michael's square jaw and guarded half-smile. "That's Thomas Turner," Michael said. Frank turned so quickly that a soup can slip from his hand. Thomas, Michael's grandfather, had been a lean army mechanic from Ohio with large hands, sharp features, and a burn scar along his left forearm. He had been kind but reserved, always sitting where he could see the door. His family remembered him as a patient man who repaired broken radios for neighborhood children but rarely spoke about the nights when sleep refused to come. "Da Nang, 1,969, Frank said. His truck hit a mine outside the perimeter. Fuel caught fire before anyone could reach him. His gaze drifted beyond the room, returning to a battlefield buried beneath more than 50 years. I pulled him through the windshield, burned both hands doing it. Stayed until the medevac came because he kept asking me not to let him die alone." Michael stared at the photograph as the truth settled inside him. Thomas had returned home, married, raised Michael's father, and built the family Michael had inherited. Without Frank, none of them might have existed. Yet the man who had once run into fire for a stranger now lived in a freezing house and counted coins for bread. Michael remembered sitting beside his grandfather as a boy, watching those scarred hands guide a fishing line through a reel. Thomas had never explained where the scars came from. He had only told Michael that courage was not the absence of fear. It was deciding that someone else mattered more than it. Frank read the realization on Michael's face. "Don't make this personal," he said. "It's bigger than me." He opened a kitchen drawer and removed a bundle of envelopes, each marked with a name, an amount, and a date. Some carried military unit numbers. Others bore the names of widows Michael did not recognize. "There are at least 12 of us," Frank continued. "Veterans, widows, men living alone. Eric collects for someone else. They offer small loans when the furnace breaks or medicine costs too much. Even after people repay them, the debt never disappears." His fingers trembled around the envelopes. "If one person talks, they punish another. Last month, they broke a man's window while his granddaughter was visiting. After that, nobody wanted to risk speaking." Michael took the envelopes and felt their slight weight settle into his palm. They contained no weapons, yet they represented a kind of violence he understood clearly. Fear repeated until resistance felt impossible. Atlas sat beside Frank and rested his head on the old man's knee. Frank's hand moved over the dog's ears, and some of the tension left his narrow shoulders. Michael looked once more at Thomas Turner's photograph, then at the 12 names in his hand. The life he had built around watching, withdrawing, and surviving no longer felt possible. "You're right," he said quietly. "This is bigger than you." Michael stood beside Frank's kitchen table with the bundle of marked envelopes spread beneath the yellow light. The snow outside had thickened. pressing against the windows and muting the neighborhood until the old house seemed cut off from the rest of Grand Rapids. He made 3 calls. The first went to Brian Sullivan, a 43-year-old former Marine communications specialist with a compact, powerful build, a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard, and close-cropped black hair fading at the temples. Brian's brown eyes rarely revealed surprise, because years of listening to broken radio transmissions under fire had trained him to remain calm when everyone else became frantic. A blast during his final deployment had damaged the hearing in his left ear, leaving him with the habit of tilting his head when people spoke, but it had also made him exceptionally patient with details others dismissed. The second call went to Jason Brooks, 35, a former reconnaissance Marine who was tall, lean, and restless, with bronze skin, sharp cheekbones, dark hair that fell untidily across his forehead, and a pale scar running from the edge of his jaw toward his neck. Jason smiled easily around friends, but trusted strangers slowly. After losing a civilian interpreter who had once warned his unit of an ambush, he had developed a personal hatred for the way frightened witnesses were ignored until it was too late. Both men arrived within an hour, bringing cold air, snow-covered boots, and the quiet certainty of people who did not need a long explanation before understanding that someone vulnerable was being hunted. Brian examined the envelopes one by one, arranging them by date and amount. Several contained small cash receipts, handwritten totals, and symbols Frank had assumed were meaningless. Brian saw a pattern almost immediately. A triangle appeared beside addresses west of the river, a circle beside homes near the rail yard, and short combinations of letters seemed to identify the person responsible for collecting each payment. "These aren't random notes," he said, leaning closer beneath the lamp. "They're routes." Jason studied the names and recognized 2 from a veterans support group he had volunteered with years earlier. Michael then called Detective Laura Mitchell. Laura arrived shortly before noon in an unmarked sedan. She was 37, tall and slender, with warm brown skin, dark hazel eyes, and thick black hair twisted into a practical knot at the back of her head. Her narrow face and straight posture made her appear stern at first, but her voice carried careful gentleness when she spoke to Frank. Laura had spent nearly a decade investigating fraud and financial abuse involving elderly victims. Her grandmother had once lost most of her savings to a home repair scam and had died, still blaming herself, an experience that made Laura relentless with predators, but unusually patient with people too ashamed to testify. She listened without interrupting while Frank described Eric, the loan, and the threats. When he finished, she placed both hands flat on the table and admitted that similar complaints had reached her department before. Each case involved small emergency loans offered to veterans or widows living on fixed incomes. Each debt continued growing after repayment. Each victim eventually withdrew the complaint. "Fear is their real business," Laura said. "Money is just how they measure it." Jason spent the afternoon knocking on doors listed in Frank's envelopes. Most opened only an inch. Some residents denied knowing Eric. Others claimed the payments were voluntary, even while their eyes moved nervously toward the street. One elderly man shut the door when Jason mentioned the police. A woman watched him through the curtains but refused to answer at all. Atlas accompanied him on the final visit, a narrow brick house owned by Margaret Ellis, a 76-year-old Army widow. Margaret was small and straight-backed, despite arthritis in both hands, with soft brown skin, silver hair cut close around her face, and dark eyes that had once belonged to someone quick to laugh. Her late husband had served 22 years, and after his death she had become cautious, private, and fiercely determined not to burden her children. She initially spoke through the locked door, insisting she knew nothing. Atlas sat on the snowy porch without moving, his amber eyes calm and his head slightly lowered. When Margaret finally looked through the glass and saw the German Shepherd waiting rather than threatening, something in her expression softened. She opened the door far enough to touch the notch in his ear. Atlas leaned gently into her hand. Only then did she allow Jason inside. Margaret revealed that Eric worked for a small lending company that targeted older people after furnace failures, medical emergencies, or funeral expenses. The loans were rarely more than a few $100s, but the collectors added invented fees until repayment became impossible. Her husband's military pension had been taken month after month, even though the original loan had been repaid twice over. From a sewing box, she produced a receipt carrying the company's name and address and Eric's signature. Laura believed it might be enough, combined with Frank's records, to request a search warrant. But 2 hours later, Margaret called in tears. A gray pickup had passed her house 3 times. Someone had left a photograph of her granddaughter beneath the porch light. She withdrew her statement and begged them never to return. That night, Michael remained at Frank's house while Brian copied the information from the envelopes. Jason checked the street, and Laura returned to the station to determine what evidence could still be used. Near midnight, the power flickered. Atlas rose from beside Frank's chair, ears lifting toward the rear of the house. Michael heard a faint scrape from the kitchen, followed by the soft crack of a window latch. He moved through the dark, but by the time he reached the back door, a shadow was already crossing the yard. Atlas lunged into the snow, forcing the intruder to drop a metal tool before disappearing between 2 garages. Michael returned to the kitchen and saw the drawer hanging open. The wooden box containing every original receipt and payment record was gone. Michael returned from the backyard, with snow clinging to his shoulders, and found Frank standing motionless beside the open kitchen drawer. The missing wooden box had held every original receipt, every handwritten payment record, and the only evidence connecting Eric Donovan to the other victims. Brian had copied several dates and symbols, but without the originals, Laura warned that Eric's lawyers could dismiss them as notes created after the fact. Atlas moved slowly around the kitchen, nose low, studying the cold air that had entered through the forced window. Near the table, Michael noticed a white envelope that had not been there earlier. Inside were $600 in crisp bills and a folded sheet listing 3 veterans' names beside amounts marked collected. Frank's face drained of color. "That isn't mine," he whispered. "I've never collected money from anyone." Michael understood the purpose immediately. The intruder had not merely stolen evidence. He had planted a story in its place, one that made Frank appear to be part of the operation. When Laura returned, she photographed the envelope without touching it and explained that fingerprints, the forced window, and the timing might help prove it had been planted. But Frank heard only uncertainty. He lowered himself into the worn kitchen chair, his narrow shoulders collapsing beneath an invisible weight. "No one will believe me," he said. "They'll see an old man behind on his bills, with cash hidden in his house." Eric knows exactly how that looks. Shame entered his voice, followed by something even more dangerous: surrender. He had survived combat, grief, hunger, and decades of hard winters. Yet, the slow violence of being doubted had finally reached a place bullets never had. Michael crossed the room, removed the photograph from 1969, and placed it on the table in front of him. In the faded image, young Frank stood beside Thomas Turner with burned hands wrapped in field bandages and smoke staining his uniform. "This man ran toward a burning truck when everyone else was backing away," Michael said. Frank stared at the picture, but did not lift his head. "That man was 22. That man is still sitting here." Michael's voice remained quiet, but its firmness filled the room. "Eric didn't make you weak. He only made you afraid. There's a difference." Frank's eyes shone with exhausted tears. For several seconds, he seemed trapped between the old habit of obedience and the memory of who he had once been. Then he reached for the photograph, pressing one trembling thumb against Thomas's face. "Your grandfather kept telling me to leave him," he murmured. "I told him Marines were too stubborn to die alone." A faint, broken laugh escaped Michael. He passed that stubbornness down. Frank finally looked at him, and something small but steady returned to his blue eyes. Brian searched the kitchen for anything the intruder might have overlooked. Jason checked the broken window and followed the footprints until they disappeared near the alley, while Laura examined the planted envelope. Atlas remained restless. He circled the room twice, then stopped beside an old wooden cabinet near the pantry. The cabinet was heavy, its dark oak surface scarred by decades of use, and one leg had been repaired with a strip of metal. Atlas lowered his head and scratched once at the floor. Michael called him away, but the German Shepherd returned immediately and scraped his claws against the same plank. Frank frowned. "There used to be a loose board there," he said. "Years ago, I hid things under it when the neighborhood had break-ins." Michael and Brian shifted the cabinet aside. Beneath it lay a warped floorboard darker than the others. Michael pried it up with a screwdriver and reached into the narrow space below. His fingers closed around a cloth-wrapped object. It was a small black notebook, its cover softened by age and its pages crowded with Frank's careful handwriting. He had begun recording every payment after Eric first changed the amount he owed, then hidden the notebook during a night of panic and forgotten it as months of fear blurred together. Inside were the full names of victims, dates, amounts taken, license plate numbers, descriptions of collectors, and addresses used for payments. Near the final pages was an entry written only 2 days earlier, a large collection scheduled for the following morning at an abandoned warehouse near the Grand River. Brian compared the symbols with his copied notes and confirmed the pattern. Laura's expression changed from concern to controlled urgency. "This is enough to build a plan," she said, "but we still need Eric speaking in his own words." Frank understood before anyone asked. His hands tightened around the notebook. Fear returned, but it no longer owned the whole of him. "You want me to meet him." Laura explained that he could refuse, that no evidence was worth his safety, but Frank looked at the photograph of Thomas and then at the 12 names in the notebook. "If I stay quiet, he keeps coming for them." The next morning, beneath a pale sky and thinning snow, Laura secured a small recording device inside Frank's coat. Michael objected to letting him enter alone, but the plan required Eric to believe the old veteran remained frightened and isolated. Officers waited out of sight, while Michael, Brian, Jason, and Atlas watched from separate positions near the river. Frank crossed the frozen yard toward the warehouse, each step slow but deliberate. The building was a rusted shell of corrugated metal with boarded windows and a loading door hanging unevenly from its track. He entered through a side door. Inside, Eric stood beneath a bare bulb, his black parka open and his narrow face unreadable. "You brought the money?" he asked. Frank forced his voice to remain steady. "I brought what I could." Eric stepped closer, studying him with the suspicious patience of a man who survived by noticing weakness. Then his eyes dropped to a slight rise beneath Frank's coat. Without warning, he seized the fabric, tore the device free, and crushed it beneath his boot. The warehouse door slammed shut behind Frank. The recording device cracked beneath Eric Donovan's boot, and the sound echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. Frank stood beneath the bare bulb, his breath shallow, his veteran cap still pulled low over his white hair. Eric searched his coat with quick, angry movements, then seized his arm and dragged him toward the rear loading door. "You should have stayed frightened," he whispered. "Fear was the only thing keeping you alive." Frank stumbled but did not beg. Outside, the wind pushed snow against the corrugated walls, hiding the low rumble of vehicles moving into position. Eric believed he had destroyed the only signal, but Brian Sullivan had anticipated that possibility. Before Frank entered the building, Brian had slipped a tracker no larger than a shirt button beneath the inner band of his cap. Its pulse now moved steadily across the screen in Brian's hands. From an unmarked van near the river, he watched the signal change direction. "He's moving Frank toward the west loading bay," Brian told Laura through the radio. Detective Laura Mitchell stood behind a concrete barrier with Michael, Jason, and 6 officers. Her dark hair was hidden beneath a winter cap, but her hazel eyes remained sharp and controlled. She had spent years watching frightened victims lose courage at the last moment. Frank had not. "We move now," she ordered. Michael released Atlas from the waiting command. The German Shepherd surged forward beside him, body low and silent, black and tan coat cutting through the gray light. Jason moved toward the southern entrance, while Laura and the officers approached the main door. Inside, Eric shoved Frank between rows of wooden crates and rusted machinery. A second man stepped from behind a stack of shipping pallets. Calvin Ross was 38, thick-necked and broad across the chest, with a shaved head, pale skin, and a reddish beard cut close to his jaw. He had once worked security at construction sites, but had been dismissed after repeatedly intimidating older workers. Eric valued him because Calvin followed orders without asking whether they were right. He took one look at Frank and frowned. "Police?" "Maybe," Eric answered. "We take him out through the river door." Calvin reached inside his jacket. Atlas stopped before Michael saw why. The dog's ears snapped toward the pallets, and a deep warning rolled through his chest. Michael changed direction instantly. Calvin stepped out with a metal baton raised, expecting to strike Michael from the side. Atlas lunged just far enough to force him backward. Calvin lost his footing on the damp concrete and crashed against the crates, the baton sliding away. Jason came through the side entrance and pinned him before he could rise. "Police! Don't move!" Laura's command filled the warehouse as officers poured through the main doors. Eric reacted faster than Frank expected. He locked one arm around the old man's chest and pulled him backward, using his thin body as a shield. In his other hand, he held a short utility knife against Frank's coat. Michael stopped several yards away, every muscle demanding movement while discipline ordered patience. Atlas stood beside him, breathing hard, eyes fixed on Eric's wrist. "Let him go," Michael said. Eric's narrow face twisted with desperation. The cold control he had worn in the alley was gone. "Back up, or the old man pays for all of you." Frank felt Eric's arm tightening around his ribs. For months, that pressure would have made him obey. He would have lowered his head, apologized, and waited for the threat to pass. But now he saw Michael in front of him, Atlas prepared at his side, and Laura standing with officers who had finally come because Frank had chosen to speak. He remembered Thomas Turner trapped inside the burning truck, smoke filling his lungs, while everyone shouted that the vehicle might explode. Frank had been terrified then, too. Courage had never meant feeling nothing. It meant refusing to let fear choose the next step. Frank drove the heel of his boot down onto Eric's foot. As Eric flinched, Frank twisted sharply and tore himself free. Atlas moved at the same instant, knocking Eric's knife arm away without biting down. Michael closed the distance, forced Eric to the floor, and held him there until Laura secured the handcuffs. Frank staggered toward the crates but caught himself before falling. His shoulders rose, his spine straightened, and his voice carried through the warehouse. "We have been silent long enough." Behind a locked office, police discovered ledgers, recorded payment schedules, copies of pension statements, photographs of victims' homes, and envelopes containing thousands of dollars. The records identified dozens of elderly veterans and military widows across western Michigan. Laura immediately sent officers to check on them, while Brian matched the warehouse ledgers to the names in Frank's notebook. By evening, Eric, Calvin, and 2 additional collectors had been arrested. The planted money in Frank's house was traced to the same numbered bundles stored in the warehouse, clearing him of suspicion. When reporters gathered outside the police station, Frank did not hide his face. He stood beneath the falling snow with his veteran cap in his hands and asked every frightened victim listening to come forward. The story aired across Grand Rapids that evening. Todd Miller watched it from his kitchen and recognized the old man he had humiliated over $4.12. The memory of Frank reaching for the loaf of bread left Todd unable to finish his dinner. The following morning, he arrived at the local Veterans Center carrying boxes of bread, milk, eggs, soup, and canned vegetables. He did not ask for a photograph or explain himself. He simply placed the food on the counter and said, "This is for Mr. Dalton and anyone else who was made to feel small." Then he stayed to help unload the rest. Frank returned home 3 days after the warehouse raid, expecting the same sagging porch, cold rooms, and silence that had greeted him for years. Instead, he saw nearly 24 people gathered outside beneath a pale winter sun. Veterans stood beside neighbors carrying toolboxes, casseroles, folded blankets, and bags of groceries. Emily Parker waited near the front steps in a thick blue coat, her blonde ponytail tucked beneath a knitted hat. Laura Mitchell stood beside Brian and Jason, looking less like a detective now and more like someone allowing herself to witness the good that sometimes followed terrible work. Michael remained near the railing with Atlas at his side, his broad shoulders relaxed in a way Frank had never seen before. For one frightened moment, Frank wondered whether he had come to the wrong house. Then warmth spilled through the open doorway. The broken furnace had been repaired, damaged roof shingles replaced, and the cracked kitchen window fitted with new glass. Fresh paint covered the water stains above the stove. Someone had reinforced the porch steps, while another neighbor had fixed the cabinet Atlas had helped move. Frank stopped at the bottom of the stairs, unable to speak. He had spent so long believing need was something to hide that receiving help felt almost more difficult than surviving without it. Michael descended one step and held out his hand. You gave people a reason to stop hiding, he said. They wanted to give something back. Frank accepted the hand, though his eyes were already wet. Atlas pressed against his leg as if reminding him that entering the house was safe. Emily had brought more than groceries. The security footage from the supermarket showed Eric watching elderly customers, following Frank, and returning on several other mornings. Emily had presented the recordings to the store's regional office, along with a proposal she had written during sleepless nights after her shifts. She asked the company to create an emergency food fund for elderly veterans and military widows who were forced to choose between groceries, medicine, and heating bills. The supermarket approved the program and appointed Emily to manage it, allowing her to leave her exhausting diner job. She told Frank the first food boxes would be delivered the following week. I should have noticed sooner, she admitted. Frank gave her the gentle smile that hardship had hidden but never destroyed. You noticed when it mattered. Those words released the guilt she had carried since the checkout line. In the kitchen, a long table had been assembled from borrowed folding sections and covered with mismatched cloths. Every chair was occupied or claimed by a coat. At the center rested a fresh loaf of wheat bread, still warm from a neighborhood bakery. Steam rose when Frank tore it open, carrying a simple, comforting scent through the room. No one mentioned the loaf that had fallen into dirty snow behind the supermarket, yet everyone understood what this one represented. Frank had once counted coins to keep bread on his table. Now the table could barely hold all the people who had come to share it. Before the meal began, Frank asked Michael to follow him into the living room. He removed the photograph from 1969 and handed it over, along with a yellowed envelope tied with faded string. Inside was a letter Thomas Turner had written months after returning from Vietnam. Thomas thanked Frank for pulling him from the burning truck and admitted that surviving had left him with a responsibility he did not yet understand. Near the end, he had written that if his children or grandchildren ever met someone too old, frightened, or forgotten to defend themselves, he hoped they would stand beside that person without asking what they would receive in return. Michael read the lines twice. His grandfather's scarred hands, quiet voice, and habit of watching doors returned to him with painful clarity. He had spent years believing distance protected him from loss. But Thomas's words revealed another truth. A life guarded too carefully could become a life never fully shared. Michael looked toward the kitchen, where Frank was surrounded by people who had once been strangers. He would have been proud of you, Frank said. Michael folded the letter carefully. I think he would have been proud of both of us. Over the following months, Eric Donovan, Calvin Ross, and the other collectors were convicted of extortion, fraud, assault, and financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. Seized funds helped repay many victims, though money could not restore every year stolen by fear. Michael and Atlas created a volunteer network that checked on veterans living alone, delivered groceries, repaired minor household damage, and connected victims with legal assistance. Brian organized the emergency phone system, Jason coordinated home visits, and Laura trained volunteers to recognize signs of financial abuse. Frank insisted on answering the first calls. His voice, once reduced to frightened whispers in an alley, became the calm sound greeting people who believed no one would understand. He never rushed them. He knew silence could be a prison, and patience was often the key. By Thanksgiving, Frank's house had become the center of the network's first holiday dinner. Snow gathered softly outside, but the repaired furnace kept every room warm. Emily brought bread, Laura carried 2 pies, Brian argued cheerfully with Jason over how to carve the turkey, and Michael stood near the kitchen doorway watching the crowded table. Frank sat at its center, wearing his Vietnam veteran cap. Atlas rested beneath his chair, then lifted his head and placed it gently on the old man's knee. Frank lowered one hand into the shepherd's fur and looked around at the faces filling his once silent home. There were no empty seats, no unpaid threats waiting outside, and no one at that table facing the cold alone. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder, light, or a voice from heaven. Sometimes God sends them quietly through a loyal dog, a stranger who notices, or a wounded heart brave enough to stand again. In daily life, we pass people carrying battles we cannot see. A kind word, a shared meal, or one moment of courage may become the answer to a prayer someone was too tired to speak. Frank's story reminds us that no act of compassion is small when it restores dignity, hope, and belonging. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe goodness still exists. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and whether you have witnessed a miracle of kindness. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, strengthen your heart, and guide your path.